everybody for coming out tonight. We're going to be discussing the proposed changes to the ordinance to address solar development in the city. Tonight, presenting with me, I have Chuck Willing and Rich Marr, both from the Concord Energy and Environment Advisory Committee. So they'll be presenting next. Here's an agenda of what we're going to go through tonight. Sort of do an overview of renewable energy, what solar 101 with some terminology, and about renewable energy within the City of Concord. And then I'll come back and talk to you about the existing ordinance, what are some of the proposed changes, and how this fits in with the master plan. And then the whole purpose of tonight is to get public feedback before we move forward with actually drafting the changes to the ordinance. So we want to get feedback from all of you, comments on what you see tonight or how you see development in the city. So, I'm sorry. And Councilor Werner over here at the end of the aisle, also, he's the council member for the Energy and Environment Committee. So I'll pass this over to
Thank you, Beth. My name is Chuck Willing, and I'm a member of the Concord Energy and Environment Committee. I just wanted to briefly acknowledge a few of our members who are here. Dot Courier, Zach Jonas, Donna Reardon, Kathy Kilday, Jennifer Galbraith, and Deb Russ. Zach. Yeah, I got Zach. We've all been working hard on various issues relating to the city's 100% renewable energy goal. Just a little background before we dive into the real topic at hand. Kind of where we start in terms of this initiative for more renewable energy and for a solar ordinance is climate change. Without belaboring it, climate change is real, it's here, and we're feeling the effects. It's the challenge of our lifetimes and maybe anyone's lifetime. It's caused by fossil fuel combustion since the beginning of the industrial age. The effects are numerous. The science has been examining how much climate change or how much temperature rise the planet can tolerate before we get into a catastrophic circumstance. And generally speaking, the consensus had been around 2 degrees temperature rise since the beginning of the industrial age. More recently, scientists have told us, no, we've got to limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius on average across the globe in order to avoid catastrophic effects. And for context, we've already achieved suffered 1 degree of temperature rise since the beginning of the industrial age. So we're kind of running out of runway on this. Therefore, the IPCC has said we have to dramatically reduce greenhouse gas emissions within the next 12 years in order to have a chance of achieving that goal. And the way we do that, generally speaking, there's a lot more to it than just this, but this is the main thing. Get off fossil fuels and get onto renewable energy completely within that time frame or a little bit longer. The other point I would make about the approach is we need local action to do this. What we've experienced up to this point has been a lot of some recognition of the problem, the examination of its effects, but kind of waiting for big international action or big national action or big state action to solve the problem. And I think a lot of us have come to the conclusion that's not going to cut it. We're going to have to act locally and hope that the accumulation of local actions take us where we need to go. So that's climate change. I want to talk a little bit about renewable energy and what's going on there. There are a lot of exciting developments in the last 10 years. Solar has taken off, wind has taken off. A lot of those projects have been built, a lot of money is poured into it, and what's happened as a result is that the cost of solar energy and wind energy has come down by 80 or 90% in the last 10 years, which has taken it from something that needed to be heavily subsidized in order to work to something that is on the brink of competing in the marketplace, and in some cases actually competing in the marketplace against conventional fuels. Onshore wind and large solar in some parts of this country are already the cheapest energy option. Cheaper than coal, cheaper than new natural gas plants, cheaper than anything else. What the energy analysts are saying, projecting forward, is that within the next 10 years, all forms of wind and solar will be cheaper than conventional fuels. So that would include solar projects that are smaller than large projects, and also offshore wind in addition to onshore wind. More about renewable energy. It brings a lot of other benefits in addition to the environmental benefits. It's a very job-intensive industry. The number one fastest growing job in the country right now is solar installer. The number two fastest growing job in the country is wind turbine technician. This is where our future jobs, or a lot of our future jobs, are going to come from. Renewable energy brings lower, we believe, especially in the future, and stable energy costs. The reason why the prices are stable on renewable energy is that you don't have to pay for the fuel. There's no commodity price involved. Basically, what you have is the cost of installing the project, to a lesser degree the cost of operating it, amortized over the life of the project, and that results in the price that you pay for that energy. It won't go up and down. Renewable energy also gives you energy independence. It's generally generated locally. So the energy generated locally means we're not subject to international upheavals or failure to supply even from elsewhere in the United States. It's energy independence is something that we ought to value. Renewable energy doesn't involve emissions to the air, so it results in better air quality, better health, and lower healthcare costs. Renewable energy to date has been associated with positive community image. People look more favorably on places that commit to renewable energy, commit to sustainability, to commit to things that are green. It makes people more happy about the places that they live and attracts other people and other businesses to come to those places. And that's especially true for the next generation as opposed to my generation. So I think it's been expressed that Concord and New Hampshire in general ought to try more to make itself attractive to young people. Well, this is a way to do it. So to sum it all up, a transition to renewable energy is a win-win-win-win-win. Before we get into the rest of the presentation, I just wanted to go over some of the terminology of solar energy just to make sure we're all speaking off the same page when we're talking about different terms. Any form of electricity generation is spoken of in terms of watts or kilowatts or megawatts. A kilowatt is 1,000 watts, a megawatt is 1,000 kilowatts. And that can be used to describe the amount of electricity that a generation source can generate, and also, as you're familiar with watts, how much electricity is consumed at a moment in time on the consumption end. The light bulbs are, the amount of energy they need is measured in watts. Meanwhile, you have kilowatt hours and megawatt hours, and that's what you see under bill. Basically, your energy charge, your distribution charge, your transmission charge are measured in amount of energy delivered over an hour period of time. So what solar and other renewable energy projects sell are kilowatt hours and megawatt hours of electricity. Solar projects are developed in a few different forms. Solar can go on your roof or a business's roof. There are ground-mounted solar projects that are placed directly into the ground with various forms of anchors. And then there are carport mounts that are placed in parking lots, and that's something we'd be very interested in seeing here. There are solar canopies that, with an anchor at the bottom, poles that extend up, and then some form of a canopy over the parking space above which panels are facing the sky and absorbing the sun's light to create electricity. A lot of times those carports also have electric vehicle charging infrastructure associated with them. In terms of space that solar projects take up, typically a solar project, a ground-mounted solar project will need about 5 acres of land in order to site 1 megawatt of solar. That can depend a lot based on the characteristics of the site. And it's also probably a bit changeable over time, whereas solar technology improves and the amount of electricity you can generate out of a particular solar panel improves, we may see that number come down a little bit where it's 4 or 3 in future years. But right now, kind of the rule of thumb is a megawatt per 5 acres of land. Solar projects deliver power to the grid. That's a grid-connected solar project, and they can also deliver power behind the meter, which generally is understood to mean connecting directly to your home. So your solar panel on your roof would be a behind-the-meter project. It's delivering power directly into your home. You're using that power directly in your home without it going through the electric grid on the way in. There are other more exotic scenarios that I won't get into right now. Net metering is a program that exists in multiple states, including New Hampshire, and basically what that means is if you have solar or some other form of energy on your property, and it's generating more energy than you need at a particular time, you can send that electricity back into the grid, and the utility company will pay you for the value of that electricity. So it's a way of, because solar panels might not generate power at exactly the moment you need it, it's a way of realizing more of the value of your solar project. Community solar is an approach that's being developed in several states, and we have a program here in New Hampshire called net metering. What that means is that a solar project could be sited in one spot, and individuals or businesses could subscribe to that community solar project in shares such that each of them could be credited for a portion of the electricity that that project generates. And I've seen it mostly expressed in terms of percentages, but it may be expressed in other ways. Energy storage is another emerging technology that is probably going to play a more prominent role as we go forward. Energy storage means you can take the electricity that's being generated from a renewable energy project or any other form of project, store it, then release it into the grid or to an end user when it is needed. And one of the beauties of energy storage right now is it solves the problem, or may help solve the problem of intermittency of renewable energy. Solar generates energy when the sun is shining, generally speaking. Wind projects generate power when the wind is blowing. That, absent some additional equipment, limits how much solar and wind we can actually accommodate, because we need power when we need power. But with storage, as that technology emerges, we'll be able to store solar power, store wind power, and use a lot more solar and wind going forward. Finally, municipal aggregation is a concept I just wanted to introduce. That is a program that exists in New Hampshire, also in other states, by which a city or a town can purchase on behalf of its residents or its businesses the energy that is used in that town. That can happen without the city actually being a municipal utility. So it can be used for renewable purposes or not for renewable purposes. There is an avenue in state law allowing cities and towns to do this, and we, as the City of Concord, might choose to use that to make more of our electricity supply green. Now I will turn it over to my colleague, Rich Mark.
Well, thank you everybody for showing up tonight. We'll try to get done before the Patriots game. Solar on structures. The first type is roof mounted. These systems are typically behind the meter, as Chuck was describing. The electricity goes from the panels on the roof down. They flow down basically into your electric panel for immediate use. That means if you are doing the laundry, you have a solar-powered washing machine. And you have a solar-powered dryer. And then, as Chuck said, the excess, if you are producing electricity and you're not using it, it goes out to the grid. We have approximately 100 to 200 houses and businesses here in Concord that have solar on their roofs. We'd love to encourage a lot more, including on our downtown buildings, our box stores, the buildings here on campus, the municipal campus, new construction, and especially our schools. The inconvenient truth is that only a small percentage of residents in town can get their electricity off rooftop, however. Many structures are not up to snow load capacities of modern requirements. And many buildings obviously don't have direct sun on their roofs. They're shaded or blocked somehow. And obviously a large number of folks in town don't own their homes. Another, the other solar on structure type is a carport, as Chuck described. We feel that it's going to play an important role in our near future. It provides shade and shelter for the cars that are underneath. Combined with storage batteries, you can have an electric vehicle charger right there on the spot, generated right there. But unfortunately, they're not economically viable quite yet. We expect them to come to town as the price goes down and as we have more and more electric vehicles. Now we're looking at different categories by size of ground mount solar. We define a small ground mount as up to 100 kilowatts of power, which is basically enough to power 10 large houses, say with air conditioning, or enough, or up to 14 average houses, and obviously enough to power a Unitarian church and a plant nursery. These can be installed in a neighborhood using group net metering. It would take about a half an acre to do a 100 kilowatt system, and enough for 10 to 14 houses. And if they got together as a collective, if they several people bought into that solar array, it would be community solar, basically the definition of community solar. Here are some examples of small solar. They're great for farms in rural areas. And again, with community solar, it should be reminded, folks don't have to be nearby. They don't have to be your next door neighbors to share in one of these. They can be across town as long as it's in the same community and with the same utility. So in our case, it's Unitil. Moving up a size to medium, these systems are 100 kilowatts to 1,000 kilowatts, 1,000 kilowatt being a megawatt, able to service 100 to 140 houses. And these too are eligible for group net metering. 1 megawatt is the current upper limit for net metering in New Hampshire. It was nearly up to 5 megawatts recently by the legislature. It narrowly missed passing, but we do anticipate that this limit will be raised to 5 megawatts or higher, hopefully in the next legislative session. Medium systems can power institutions, businesses, apartment complexes, large farms, and as we said, community solar for up to 140 houses. And the picture on the left is in Peterborough. That array there powers their wastewater treatment plant, which is a huge consumer of electricity. The picture that's labeled Durham, that array is on a former gravel pit, actually in neighboring Lee. It powers all of Durham's municipal buildings. And so that's kind of you were saying, that's kind of a form of complicated net metering, but it's able to do all the buildings in Durham that are municipally owned. A 4 or 5 acre piece of land can support about 1 megawatt with under 50% lot coverage. In other words, less than 50% of the land is covered with panels with 50% lot coverage. Doing simple division, 1 acre could support 200 to 250 kilowatt system, which would service 20 to 30 houses with under 50% lot coverage. So the definition of large solar installation, as we've defined it, is 1 megawatt up to 10 megawatts. 10 megawatt probably is the upper limit for Concord due to the acreage required. These are the most efficient systems, they're the most cost-effective, and therefore they offer the lowest cost per kilowatt for the end user. A 10 megawatt system can supply 1,000 to 1,400 homes, and right now we have large systems that are being contemplated or being designed or being constructed in neighboring towns. There's one being designed right now in Hopkinton, and Londonderry is under construction, I believe. So they're definitely coming to our area. And with changes in net metering law, we hope that these largest systems will be able to be used for community solar someday. Here's some examples of, in the upper left, you can see the plantings were done to provide some screening, some buffering for people driving by or living nearby. And in the lower right, note the planting of pollinators. That's not by accident. Those are planted by the installers, probably required by the community or by the state. We are definitely in favor of pollinators as they attract bees and birds that take advantage of the pollen from those pollinators, and it provides habitat for bees and birds, and they obviously pollinate the surrounding area, so it's really great for the farms in the area. There are only a few parcels in Concord large enough and appropriate for a 10 megawatt system because it requires up to 60 acres. But we do have more parcels available for 2 megawatt systems, 3 megawatts, 4 and 5. So some of the features of medium and large systems include, as we talk about, the larger installations are the most cost efficient. They provide significant revenue for the host city. A 10 megawatt system would cost the developer $10 million to $15 million to construct. That equates into hundreds of thousands of dollars to the host city in the equivalent of property taxes per year. So hundreds of thousands of dollars to the city per year without adding traffic, without adding additional police and fire services, and without adding children into the school system. And for farmers who need extra revenue, predictable, consistent revenue year after year, they could devote a parcel to solar, lease the land for thousands of dollars per acre, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 per acre per year. It can keep them in the farming business. So we would encourage, perhaps even require co-location of solar with these pollinators we just talked about. We can see in some cases solar systems co-locating with animals grazing, raising certain crops, and beekeeping. And it's important to remember, we can't emphasize this enough, that these arrays are not permanent structures. They have a 30 or so year life. After that, the array would be disassembled, recycled, the land restored to its previous condition, and actually replenished in many cases. Many folks find solar arrays surrounded by wildflowers attractive and a symbol of clean, non-polluting energy source that they are proud of. In some cases, though, we recognize the need to require screening or buffering the view of a system with natural vegetation and sometimes with plantings brought in. And lastly, I'd like to point out that solar arrays are referred to as solar farms in many states. They harvest energy from the sun, and they provide it around to the community to folks who don't have the ability to harvest the sun for themselves. In essence, that's what farms do. Thank you very much. I think Chuck has a couple of slides left.
Yeah. Just a couple of more points I want to make. For a little more context, the City of Concord, through the City Council, set a goal of 100% renewable energy in July of this year. And what that means is community-wide, we will achieve 100% renewable electricity by the year 2030. and we will have 100% renewable energy for thermal and transportation by 2050. It's a non-binding goal passed by city resolution. It needs to be implemented. We are, on the Concord Energy and Environment Committee, are taking the lead on implementation by drafting a strategic plan, so that we're in the beginning stages of that right now. And our schedule is to submit our plan to the City Council next summer, and that will be following a stakeholder process and seeking a lot of input from the community. But in addition, when the final product is done, people will have the opportunity to review it and comment on it. To achieve our goal, and this starts to get us to the topic at hand, we believe we need to generate as much renewable energy as we can within our borders. Our goal doesn't limit us to renewable energy generated within our borders, and in fact, I expect that we're going to have to import some of our renewable energy from places outside the city of Concord, but it would be much easier to achieve our goal, and I think we would also realize some of the other benefits associated with renewable energy if we generated as much of it as we can within our borders. And of the energy that we will generate within our borders, we believe that the lion's share of it, the overwhelming share of that, will be solar, although it will not necessarily be only solar. So to the topic of an ordinance, we want to encourage solar energy development in Concord. We are already receiving inquiries and proposals from developers to build solar energy projects in Concord, so we want to keep that flow going, but we also want to control how it's developed. As Beth will talk about right now, quite a bit of proposed solar energy is allowed under our ordinance, but maybe it will be proposed in places where we don't want it to be sited. So what we want to achieve through doing a solar ordinance is to both encourage it and give a streamlined process to it, but also control it where it needs to be controlled. Timing-wise, one reason to move ahead on this right now, aside from the fact that we're getting proposals that we need to deal with, is there is a federal investment tax credit that solar energy projects typically rely on that is due to start winding down at the end of 2019. So what we'd like to do is get our permitting rules straight to allow at least some group of projects to do what they need to do by the end of 2019 to qualify for the full tax credit before it begins to wind down. And basically, again, we want to clarify the permitting process. In some cases, the permitting process is already just fine, but maybe we need to explain it better to those who want to build solar projects. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Beth.
Thanks, Chuck. I just realized I don't think I ever introduced myself. I'm Beth Fenstermacher. I'm the Assistant City Planner. Also, we have Heather Shank, who's the City Planner, and Carlos Bahia, who's the Deputy City Manager for Community Development. And Sam Durfee, our Senior Planner. So we have a lot of city staff here tonight, and members of the Planning Board as well, here to listen to all the feedback that you'll bring to us tonight. So as Chuck mentioned, we do have some existing solar installations in the city. Solar is allowed under the existing ordinance, but we've heard some feedback that it's not so clear the way that it is stated within our ordinance. So we understand that's sort of a low-hanging fruit that we can do with the changes to the ordinance, is to clarify how solar is permitted within the city. So right now, rooftop installations in both residential and non-residential districts are allowed. They just require a building permit and an electrical permit. Right now, there's over about 240 permits that have been issued for solar installations in the city, and that's both for rooftop and ground mounted. The non-residential, right now, Target, the Grapponi Center, Freedom Cycle on Manchester Street, the New Hampshire Department of Motor Vehicles, those are all sort of large-scale rooftop installations on non-residential properties right now. Ground-mounted solar installations within residential properties also allowed. Those don't have to go through a planning review process, building permit, electrical permit as well. They have to adhere to the setback requirements, so required within the side or the rear of the house, outside of the setback limitations. They're limited in size.
all relieved.
Can you all make, okay. I'm losing my train of thought. So the solar installations for residential properties are limited by size. They must service thank you, Jan, the house itself. So it's for own personal use. It's not being sold back to the grid or to outside. So it's not a commercial opportunity. It's just to service the house itself. And ground-mounted solar installations for non-residential is allowed in all the districts throughout the city. There's the performance districts. Those are required by right, so it's not through any special planning permit that's required besides site plan review. And all the other districts, what we call a conditional use permit is required for any of those installations, where they come to the planning board for a permit that they have to get for the use, and the planning board can place conditions on it. And then they also go through the site plan review. So the master plan was last updated in 2008, and at that time we weren't really dealing with these large-scale solar installations that are being proposed today. So it wasn't really addressed specifically within the master plan itself. And that's sort of why we're trying to get some public feedback now, because that opportunity back then, we didn't talk about that, so we want to talk about it now before we do the next update of the master plan. We want to address the ordinance now before waiting for that. So the city developed the urban growth boundary, which concentrates development mostly along the river itself, where you see more of the dense development within Concord. And then outside of that, the open space residential district, the less dense residential districts are outside the urban growth boundary. And those areas have the larger lots, which can support these larger solar installations. The recommendations from the master plan were to keep those areas open with only at least in the open space residential district, not have more than 10% lot coverage, and to preserve scenic vistas and natural amenities within those areas. But in support of what we're doing, or what is being proposed for the ordinance changes, there is an energy chapter that addresses bringing renewable energy to the city, and also supports development that increases the tax base within the city. So the energy chapter was updated after was added after the original master plan update came through. It doesn't necessarily address land use itself as the master plan does, but it does address all the renewable energy goals that fed into the 100% renewable energy goals that were adopted this summer by City Council. It encourages residents, businesses to adopt renewable energy. But at that time, it was supporting smaller scale, so less than 1 megawatt facilities. That's what was within the master plan, but now we're getting proposals for larger than 1 megawatt facilities. So we want to talk about where do we want to see those in the city? Do we want, right now, the most economic sense is to put it in these green fields in the open space areas right now, because they're prime and cheaper to start putting these larger installations. A little tough to see, but this is the zoning map, just to give you an idea. This lighter olive green it looks like on the screen, those are the residential open space districts. So those are the areas with the larger lot sizes, and that's where you're going to see more of the proposed large-scale solar development. So we were given a proposal by the Energy and Environment Committee for some recommended changes to the ordinance to address the solar development, clarifying how it's permitted, and part of that will be sort of a one-page cheat sheet that we can put on the website, so somebody coming into the city that wants to do solar development can just go there and see a flow chart of how to develop within the city and understand what our permitting process is. We want to look at what size facilities want to be permitted and with what districts. Do we want to have the same size citywide? Do we want to reduce the size in certain districts? And do we want to do that by lot coverage or by capacity? Some model ordinances do it based on capacity, others do it based on a modified lot coverage. And then we'll have to update the stormwater regulations and the site plan regulations, as well as the zoning ordinance. Some of the regulation updates will also be design standards, so when the planning board does review any of these projects that come through, it gives them some standards to look at when they're deciding on whether the project goes through or any recommendations that come along with the permit. So as Rich pointed out, there's options for planting buffers or doing larger setbacks, requiring the pollinator habitat plantings or co-locating with agricultural operations, or minimizing impacts to natural resources, either limiting the amount of tree clearing that can occur, or whether it happens outside of wetland buffers. Those are the types of things that we're gonna have to go through as we're updating this ordinance. And then also for larger scale projects, whether we require decommissioning, and that's part of the plan when this life of the installation ends in 20 to 30 years, what happens to that land? So if the city has control over that, so it's not just left fallow, and then we have leftover solar panels that are no longer in use, we can require bonds or some other legal documentation that requires them to return the land to what it was before that solar installation was put in. And then another option that we can look into is requiring that any large-scale operations sell part of that energy back to the city, and we could do that through the municipal aggregation, or the city can use that for credits, and this would help local residents and businesses meet their renewable energy goals by 2050. Is for private.
It's 2030.
It is 2030 for private residents as well. And this is just an example of a recent community solar or group net metering that Ed talked about earlier. This is in Hollis, and this is private residents that had a wide open field, and this may be sort of like a similar property that you would see off Mountain Road or somewhere in the East Concord or residential districts of West Concord. It was one house. They installed this facility and 21 people in the community, so they didn't have to be direct neighbors, but they did all have to be under the same utility company, and they buy into this. This gentleman that owns the house doesn't benefit financially from this, so that's the difference. He's not selling it for his own personal revenue. This is something that's feeding into the community, and it's benefiting the community. Nobody's making money off of it, but it's providing them with that renewable energy. So this is a type of installation that we may have different types of regulations for. Say we support something of this size as long as it supports community solar. So the big question, or the topic that we're having the biggest discussion about, is lot coverage and how we look at lot coverage with solar development. So under the existing ordinance, lot coverage is defined as any building, structure, or impervious surface. So typically with the development, we're looking at like a house or a building, driveway, anything that you would think of as a structure or an impervious surface. It's not just about the impervious surface though, or the stormwater, it's also about the visual impacts. How does it impact the aesthetics of the site? So this is just a quick little brief summary of, these are all the zoning districts within the City of Concord. Hopefully you can see it's kind of a light up on this here. So RO, that's the open space residential. This is the percentage of lot coverage that's allowed under the existing ordinance. So 10% of that site is permitted to be impervious, and that's that little dot. And then as you get out of the residential districts and more into the commercial and industrial and performance districts, you're all the way up to 85%. So right now, if somebody came in and proposed a large-scale solar development, say in the industrial district, they'd have an easier time getting through under the existing ordinance, meeting those lot coverage requirements. So I'm bringing this up as an example because it's so well known. I know it's been covered in the press, and I was in New Orleans and this came up at a national conference that I didn't bring it up, somebody else found it. That this was a project that came through a couple of years ago off of West Portsmouth Street, a 10 megawatt facility. They were required, under the current ordinance, the zoning administrator determined that lot coverage was 27.3%, where 10% is allowed. So it went to the zoning board of appeals, and they did not get they were required to get a variance. They did not get their variance. But I just want to visually sort of have you see what we're talking about. This yellow line is the lot boundary, total 68.58 acres. Under some model ordinances and under the recommendations that came from the Energy and Environment Committee for proposed changes to the ordinance, they would only count the footings and the buildings that support this, the installation as the lot coverage. And that, if we use that proposal, this facility would only count for 2.5% of lot coverage, and that would be allowed under the existing ordinance. But if you look at just sort of the outline of the occupied area, as we're just calling it in quotes, that would have been 42.8 acres. And that was the thought of that's sort of a more visual impact than just looking at 2.5 versus 40 or 62.5%. And that's where we're trying to figure out, how do we want to look at lot coverage for these? Because we understand it's not 42.8 acres of coverage, but at the same time, as you're looking across it, it's 42.8 acres of occupied area. So we did a little bit of a study looking at information that's available from Unitil about where three-phase power is located, and that's what is required to return that energy back to the grid. That's what the utility requires. So a quarter of a mile is the distance that they use where they don't have to put in additional infrastructure and make it more economical. So anything outside of a quarter of an acre would require much more investment from the developer, so they try to find something within a quarter of a mile. So this is looking at state, city, and privately owned properties. States in the reddish colors, you'll see blue is all the city-owned parcels, and then all the greens, the lighter green properties, those are privately owned properties that are within a quarter of a mile that could support a form of a solar installation. And as you get lighter, those are the larger ones that could do over a megawatt or 10 megawatts. And the smaller ones could support 1 megawatt. So sort of the boldest colors that you can see, those are the 1 megawatt, and as they get lighter. So, as I mentioned, we brought you here tonight because we want to get feedback with the information that was presented tonight. How do you feel about where solar is developed within the city? Do you want to see more of it within the more industrial areas, or do you want to support it within the open space areas, or limiting size? These are just some prompt questions, but if you have any comments on your own that you want to come up and bring to us, because this is being recorded by Concord TV, we'll just repeat the question back so everybody can hear it, but unless anybody has anything else, we'll open it up to you all.
So I have a quick question, and it's probably a clarification. I'm a little confused when you say it has a life expectancy of 30 years, and at which point the structure would be removed and the land would be restored. Why wouldn't you just put a hole in the system? I mean, a building could be considered permanent, but you can also knock it down and build a parking lot. So nothing's really permanent. However, I would think 30 years is pretty permanent. So why do you feel that you wouldn't just put another solar?
So the question, I'm going to have them address that. The question is, why do we consider 30 years sort of the end of life, and would we consider that another solar installation just wouldn't replace it after 30 years? Nothing's really permanent. It could be, or nothing's really temporary. So I'll let them address that question.
I mean, that's a great question. The reason we don't anticipate that it would be replaced in 30 years in kind is that technology is changing incredibly quickly. The building integrated systems, that's a catchphrase for, right now they're developing windows that are solar collectors, roof shingles that are solar collectors, siding on new buildings that are solar collectors. There's films, there could be cold fusion coming. There is proposed wind, some of the towers out in the ocean where nobody can see. They're talking about blades that are longer than a football field that produce a gigawatt of electricity per turbine. We honestly don't anticipate, we kind of think of this as an old computer in those room-sized computers back in the 70s, that this technology will be replaced and these will be dinosaurs in 30 years.
And that would be almost like cell towers too.
Hopefully.
Yeah, the only thing I wanted to add to that is that typically when solar projects are developed, they will have leases for 20 or 30 years of that time. So that's how the developers think of the life of the project. Obviously, it could be different. They might buy the land or do something else.
When you were showing the map about the coverage area where, the 62% versus the, that one. So in terms of impact, I know a lot of the concern is the water runoff and such with hard surface. What is the impact of solar panels in terms of water concerns?
Sure. I don't think the water was the biggest concern. It was a lot of it was the visual impact of it. But we would address change our stormwater regulations. It just changes where the concentrated flow goes. For a flat site like this, it may not be as big of an issue, but as you get on a slope, it changes the way that the water is falling onto the site. So it's, yes, there's open ground underneath it, but it's still hitting another surface and then sheeting off and directly hitting one spot. So that may be something that we may want to address in our stormwater regulations of how you just treat that so you don't have scour or anything else like that. But for this one in particular, I think it was a lot more of the visual impact, but on some steep slopes, it'll be much more of a stormwater impact.
What happens with land that has some kind of an easement on it? I'm thinking of conservation or agricultural land. And is it a competing use? Is that seen as compatible? How's that addressed?
Sure, so, yeah. I was going to repeat the question. The question was, how does this impact, or is this compatible or not with conservation easement and conservation land? So the quick answer is you would have to look at what the language of the easement is. Some may allow it. Some agricultural easements allow solar installations only to the extent that they support the farm itself, not that they could sell that off. It may be considered, if it's more of a private benefit than a public benefit, so if it's financially benefiting the owner of that property and it's within an easement, it may not be allowed under the terms of the easement. Does a member of our Conservation Commission have anything to say?
There are not a lot of easements around right now that are really clear about what's allowed and what's not allowed.
Yeah.
But some of the federal easements are on land that is for agriculture, and the solar or wind installation cannot interfere with the agricultural use of the property.
Okay, in summary, there's not a lot of them. Right now, it's not clear, but on federal lands, you can't conflict with the agricultural use
And
of the
some of the
property.
easements are old, so they wouldn't have been thinking about solar.
Correct, yes. I think each of those.
And those would be unlikely to be able to be changed.
For the Hollis example that you gave, what is the advantage for the person who provided the land to do so, or just out of goodness of his heart? Were there any tax benefits?
That I'm not 100% sure of. It may just be that he
What was
had
the
the,
question?
oh, I'm sorry, the question was, what was the benefits for the gentleman that gave up his property for the solar installation in Hollis, for the community solar? There may have been some incentive from the town, but it may be that this was something he really believed in, and under their existing ordinance, this is what was allowed, so he went out and did and found people to be part of that community solar program. Yeah, and the other comment, they all just invested together and he just put it on his property because he had the available land.
Can I get a little bit more information for a farm that's interested in doing a large-scale installation that the city might actually want to be the off-taker? That seemed a little unclear when you talked about that being the potential requirement.
Sure, the question was about if there was a proposed installation on a farm and the city would be the benefactor of the electrical. That we haven't quite figured out yet. We would have to set up either a municipal aggregation, as was briefly discussed before. We still are looking into what the legalities of that would be. It may be something that has to get worked out with the electric utility, whether the city gets credit or something like that, but that's still something that we're trying to iron out.
Yeah, I might add, the reason we're talking about it is that we've kind of heard that some people's view of large solar projects that send their power to other places is that there's not enough of a community stake in that project. So we're talking about the idea as one way to address that concern. And yeah, it could be either, if it was implemented, purchased by the city itself or purchased through municipal aggregation to serve the residents of the town.
Yes.
This may sound really silly, but is there any way you can like camouflage them? You know, like paint them fall colors or something?
The question was, can you camouflage solar panels? I think right now most people just use vegetation to buffer or do setbacks where you wouldn't see it from the road. I mean, he may be the only person that sees it and doesn't care what it looks like, but Have you all heard of any other types of treatments?
Only, not specifically, I mean, technicians have played with how it presents. I mean, for instance, there was a big problem with solar panels being sited near airports for glare reasons. It was disturbing the ins and outs of air traffic, so they developed anti-glare coatings on these things. And I think I've heard of different sort of things that are being done for appearance, but more or less what you're generally seeing out there right now are things that look like this. And sometimes they're sited on properties where there really isn't a view of the panels. Sometimes they're sited near where people don't mind the view, and other times they are buffered so that whoever might see it would not, or without the buffer wouldn't have to see it. But I would expect going forward at some point there will be more, different ways to make these panels appear.
And that's a bird's eye view. We have to keep in mind that that is not a street view perspective.
Keep in mind that that's a bird's eye view of that system, and developers will often take pictures with a drone or whatever to show what it looks like from the sky to get the whole thing. But when you're seeing it from the street view, you definitely don't see that many panels.
And just to take another point of view, I mean, to some extent, visual impact is really in the eye of the beholder, right? And we're not used to seeing property filled with solar panels. It's not something that we're used to seeing. But yet we think nothing of going by farms that, and I'm not a farmer, so I don't understand why certain fields are covered in black plastic to maybe prevent weeds from growing. I don't know. But that to me looks just as ugly, if you will, as a field full of solar panels. And at some point, maybe somebody thought that growing a lot of corn in a field wasn't as attractive as leaving the field to be a natural field. So I think we have to get beyond the point of, wow, that's pretty, and no, that's ugly, and get around that, because if we get so worried about things being so-called ugly, we're not going to have much of a field left to look at all. It's going to be underwater from global warming. So just throwing it out there.
I will summarize: beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and that we need to, perspectives will change as time moves on.
Yeah, that wasn't really a question, was it?
But I just wanted to repeat for the audience at home. There was another hand.
So I know that utilities have by state law requirements for renewable standards. That a certain percentage of the electricity that they provide is from renewable. How is this, like, Unitil is our electricity provider, so Unitil would have to prove that they're getting 100% of their electricity from renewable, correct? For them to service customers in Concord?
Oh, yeah, so to repeat the question is whether Unitil would have to, how they would prove that they're meeting their renewable energy goals as a utility?
Yeah, there's really two ways to meet the 100% renewable energy goal. And set aside that people can generate their own solar power, and that could be part of the equation. But to get to 100%, we'll have to take some power from the grid, and that will either be supplied by Unitil as it is right now, and then if we do that, yes, there will be interactions with the state RPS in terms of how that gets applied. But the municipal aggregation idea is basically that the city takes control of the electricity supply that comes in and makes the decision to purchase renewable energy from projects in Concord or outside of Concord to meet that requirement, so we don't have to go through Unitil if we do that. And the other thing about municipal aggregation, again, it's not taking the utility out of the business of being a utility. They would still own the poles and wires and would charge transmission and distribution fees, but the energy supply would be the city's decision if we did that.
Just wanted to add something to that. So right now, the city is technically 100% renewable energy in terms of our electric use, just for municipal operation. And that is because presently we purchase what are called renewable energy credits from Midwest Wind. And we're 100% right now at that category. But that is a commodity that is very price sensitive. And it could well be a year from now But it would not be attractive at all for us to contract in that way. So part of the reason that we have to move in this direction is to control our own energy destiny, to know that over the long term, we are generating our own power for us to stay in this community. So I just wanted to bring that up, that yes, it's true to say we're 100% renewable energy at present, but doing these kinds of projects and also municipal projects, putting solar on the landfill, down at the wastewater treatment plant, maybe some other places in the city, will give us an ability to generate the approximately 5.5 megawatts that we as a municipal operation consume a year. If we can take care of that first, and it's eminently reasonable on the path that we're talking about now, that by 2021 or 2022, giving contracting, construction, interconnection agreement, length of time with Unitil and so forth, it's eminently reasonable that given our opportunities to do on the municipal side, that we can be at 100% energy renewable for our city operations within that time frame. And it's really important for us to do that because that shows leadership in terms of the city, operations, governments, and leaders. So that is the first step, but these larger projects and these additional community projects that we're talking about over the long term would get us to the rest of the goal in terms of, at least partway, in terms of our 2050 goal. And also, as Chuck mentioned, it's not limited in terms of the amount of energy that we generate within our borders. I can easily envision 15 years from now, Concord and many other communities in New Hampshire purchasing offshore wind that's generated in the Gulf of Maine that is also added to that renewable portfolio. So just wanted to sort of paint a larger picture in terms of context about how that all fits together.
Can you clarify something when you just said it was 100% electricity is already renewable? The municipal.
Municipal operations only. So the City of Concord, our electric use, which is about 5.5 megawatts a year.
So you're talking city buildings, city
Yes,
transportation.
city government is 100% renewable, but under the conditions of renewable energy credits, which are price sensitive. And again, we want to be in a situation where we have absolute control over our own energy destiny and we're generating it for us and not sending it to Massachusetts or New Jersey or whatnot in the future. So.
On that point, your piece of paper here reads, now therefore be it resolved.
Mhm.
And you talk about the amount of energy consumed in the city of Concord. That means to me, all the houses, my house, all the houses and businesses in Concord, not just the municipal government.
That's correct. So I was making the
maybe
distinction between,
what is the actual mission or goal?
the goal is 100% renewable energy for the entire community, not just municipal operations.
It is?
Yes, by
Okay.
2030.
All right.
So what we envision, though, what I'm saying is that as a first step along that path, it's really important that we as a city take the leadership to take care of our own home, our own business first. Make sure that we as government operations are 100% renewable energy. That's relatively easy, actually, in terms of envisioning that by 2021 or 2022 on the path that we're on, and we were in fact talking about that just today. It is certainly much more challenging in terms of the overall city goal. But if we are able to purchase energy from elsewhere, if we are able to build more solar within the city proper, if we are able to have community solar as was demonstrated in Hollis and various neighborhoods, then that is the kind of goals and operations and opportunities that would exist to move us to the larger goal of our community being 100% renewable energy. So.
Someone mentioned that this is non-binding or non-mandatory. Is that enough, given what we know about the progress of global warming? Is it really possible that we can reach 100% if it's not mandatory?
I believe it is, and I think that the driver over the period of time will be the cost. I'm a big believer in the fact that, yes, governments have to set ambitious goals, but I think we will be aided greatly in this enterprise of meeting this challenge of climate change and controlling our own energy destiny by the private market. What I mean by that is that, as Chuck had mentioned, the price of renewable energy is driving down, and it makes economic sense, if nothing else, to choose those energy sources that are the least costly. In this case, it's a win for everyone, because in the future, these renewable energy sources will be the least costly ways to provide us energy, will also help us meet these climate goals and the global challenge that we face in terms of climate change. So, yeah.
Just to follow up on that, are you suggesting that the city would engage in purchasing power from other places only if it was economical for the taxpayers? Or are you suggesting that the city spend additional money, taxpayers' money, to make that goal?
My belief, the question was, would the city only purchase renewable energy if it was price competitive and benefit the residents of Concord and benefit our budget, so to speak, as an economic choice, economic aspect. I believe that, as a committee, we don't believe that the city would make a rational economic choice in our budgeting of choosing energy sources that did not meet the definition of being the best price. Having said that, I firmly believe that given trends and how trends are so rapidly developing around price of renewable energy compared to traditional energy sources, gas and oil, I don't think we're going to be facing that situation. I really do think that we are going to be in a situation where the rational economic choice will also be the best choice for the environment and will meet that equation of being supportive of the economic interests of the residents of our city.
Oh, I knew that was a mention. So we blind everybody. All right, I know we had a lot of talk about the renewable energy goal, but that's been passed. So I'm hoping we can focus on the changes to the ordinance tonight.
That's exactly what I'd like to do.
Okay.
So I'll just make it clear that I'm representing both myself as a resident homeowner in Concord, as well as my professional role as the executive director of the New Hampshire Sustainable Energy Association. I think that solar of all sizes should be allowed and made possible everywhere in Concord. And as far as the lot coverage issue, I feel strongly that what the Energy Committee proposed is the right approach. That's a pretty standard approach in many places that's been used and adopted. I do think that aesthetics are very subjective. I don't think a solar panel is anything that needs to be camouflaged. I would be extremely proud to have a 10 megawatt solar array here in Concord, and I would love to see it.
I agree with her.
Just to summarize for those at home, it was support for solar being allowed anywhere within the city without restricting size or location, and using the proposed impervious surface only counting as the footings in the buildings as proposed by the Environment Committee.
I just have one comment. I've seen some examples where communities have they've got a little bit of pushback in that if you have a lot of open space, forests, where people have come in and wanted to put in solar arrays in existing forests, so have clear cut the canopy. And I think we have to tread very lightly on that because the canopy, forest canopy is depleting anyway. So there's this balance, and I think that we have to be very respectful of our master plan. So there has to be a balance, and obviously it would be more desirable to use our existing open spaces the capped landfill, opportunities without actually, someone could potentially go into private land and clear cut, 30 acres. And
So that comment was about how you balance whether someone comes in and clear cuts a forest, giving up the canopy versus putting up the solar. And I know there's some ordinances that restrict the amount of clearing that can occur for solar installations. So that could be one way of balancing that.
You know, I guess I feel like we have a lot of large buildings, big buildings. Why not utilize those buildings, the roofs on those buildings as places because they're already there. They're already taking up space and they would provide, good opportunities for solar panels. I think about that. Everett Arena, for example. I know logistically and cost-wise, there would be all those things to consider, but it seems like we should utilize our building space as much as possible.
So that comment was utilizing large existing buildings as much as possible for solar installations. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Heather Shank. I'm the city planner. Part of the reason that we're holding this meeting here tonight is because we want to ask the question, does the community feel that these large solar installations are consistent with the goals in our master plan for the rural district of Concord? Because we don't know the answer to that question because it's not really contemplated in our ordinance. So I appreciate all of you coming out here, and it seems that a lot of people here are very in favor of solar. So that one of the issues that is of concern to us, and we're being asked, part of what we're being asked is to change our regulations to allow these large facilities in districts where they would not now be allowed because of the lot coverage maximum or minimum in the RO district, in the rural districts of Concord. So that's a concern to us because we just want to make sure that we're making the right recommendations to council to amend our ordinance in a way that's most beneficial for the community and the people who live in those districts. So for those of you who feel comfortable, I'm just curious, how many here live in a rural area of Concord? And so, so not too many people that are here actually live in a rural area of Concord. But of those, I know that many people, whether they live in the rural areas or not, highly value and appreciate the natural features and all the trails and the farmland that we have in Concord. I live in the city, but one of the things that I love about Concord are all of the farms. So again, for those who feel comfortable, so what this particular property is showing us is that while the lot coverage may actually, in accordance with our current ordinance, this lot coverage would be considered under 30%. However, the actual disturbance to this property is over 60%. So just by a show of hands, how many people here are comfortable with this level of impact in the RO district?
For solar.
Yeah.
For solar, correct.
Regardless of where we live?
Correct. I am not discounting your vote because of where you live. It just weighs like 10% less. And for those who feel comfortable, is there anyone who's uncomfortable with this level of impact in the RO district? So a few people as well feel uncomfortable.
More of a question?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm not saying I'm uncomfortable, but you're talking zoning.
Correct.
You're talking change.
Yes.
It's definitely going to create discomfort for some people. And, we know we're here trying to represent moving forward on solar. But we can probably also presume that there are people living in some of those areas, possibly on developed streets, but near the orchard or wherever. They're going to get upset when a proposal like this comes in. So it is about selling this program.
Yeah, it's definitely a balance that we have a responsibility to try to maintain, and that council ultimately is going to have to account for when they're making these decisions. You wanted to comment?
I didn't put my hand up to your first question because as it was proposed, I was sort of on the fence. If there are regulations in there for some buffers or that there's got to be a lot of wildflowers, then I would feel comfortable, or if there's sheep grazing between them. But as I look at it right here, it looks really massive, and so that's the perception that she was talking about.
Well, it's a little deceptive too, because you're unlikely, this is an aerial view. So this view is perhaps of concern only to those people who are concerned about clearing natural resources, functioning farmland, and that just are ideologically opposed to a solar farm being this large, potentially industrial development in the rural district. But from an aesthetic viewpoint, you're gonna go by on the road and you're either gonna see one row of solar panels, or you're not gonna know if that's 10 panels or 1,000, because you're gonna have the same view either way. So we can certainly mitigate for those aesthetic impacts. It's maybe some more of the others that we wanna make sure that the community is in support of that.
Right, so I think it is, as you're saying, it's a selling point, but in the
Correct.
regulations, has to be something in there so that as it gets proposed to the public, it doesn't just get proposed to look like that.
Correct.
That's-
Sir?
I'm just curious, the background to this lot. Is this a single-family residence or an old farm, or what is?
No, this is the
nursery, the brochure
the
nursery.
brochure nursery.
Okay,
That I think is visible from the interstate.
from 93.
No.
No,
No, it's not visible, that's a different part of their nursery. Sorry.
Okay.
So then if I may continue to comment on what this lady said, if my property and all of my neighbors were covered like this, it would look pretty bizarre. But if there were a few of these around town on large plots, that would be wonderful, and I think it would look beautiful.
So this map is particularly helpful because, and unfortunately you really can't see it so well, because the largest parcels are just whited out because of the coloring of this. But so there are actually some pink parcels that you can't see, they just look white. And some pale blue and some pale green parcels that are parcels that are 50 acres or larger. Those are the parcels that, and maybe this is something we can make available online so people can look at it on their own and see, but those are the parcels that would be of interest to someone putting a very large facility or a 10 megawatt facility on their property. I don't know that we know what the market would be. Would we get 2? Would we get 14? I mean, that's not, we can't necessarily say, okay, we've got enough, and have a quota in that sense.
Could you point to some of them on
Sure.
the screen? Of the large parcels, just point to them? Okay.
So there's one that is,
Show us another one.
So out here, this is Mountain Road. As you come up, right here, there's an existing, that field and that big house that you can see. That's under an easement, this larger one right here, but there's another large one that's a single-family residence right there. So that's one of the other larger parcels that's privately owned. Out here, off of that Bog Road, there's a bunch of them back here. That would be the large, right now privately owned by Garvin's Falls, that's a large area. Some of the larger parcels do have existing easements on them, so that is another challenge that we talked about earlier of what the language of those easements are. Those would even be allowed.
Has anyone looked at using like utility right-of-ways that already exist, that are already cut and open, using those for solar arrays?
The question was whether anybody's looked at using existing utility rights of way that are already cut and cleared for installing solar. No, not that I'm aware of.
I think it would be worth looking into. The problem is the utility right-of-ways would be controlled by the utilities. We need their position or their permission to use them in that way. But
I'll just take them by eminent domain.
I have a comment from a friend who wasn't able to be here this evening. I'm happy to read it. I'm happy to submit it, but while I've been sitting here listening to the discussion, I wanted to add some of my own opinions. I live here in Concord, but I grew up in Colorado, and my parents have solar panels on their house. They have a neighborhood wind turbine, and solar panels are everywhere in Colorado. They're on houses, they're on businesses, they're on bus stops, they're on carports, they're even on dog houses. So, I'm finding this discussion sort of mind-blowing because I am used to seeing solar panels everywhere. And I personally think solar is beautiful. I'm an artist. I find solar panels aesthetically beautiful. And it's certainly more beautiful to me to have solar panels than to have, poisonous and dangerous pollutants that are emitted by fossil fuels. So I really believe that sustainable energy really should be allowed everywhere without restrictions. And when I'm driving around Vermont, or if I'm in Germany, and I see these huge solar arrays, like, I'm sort of like, yay, they're helping to save the planet. So I just want to offer the perspective of someone who's been surrounded by solar panels and wind turbines, you know, my entire time growing up. I just think they're wonderful. I think they're beautiful, and I think they're wonderful. So, and my friends' comments, I'm either happy to read them or just
You can
Give
give
your
us a
comment.
letter afterwards and we
Okay.
can.
Just to follow up, are you accepting written comments for a certain period following this, and who should they be sent to?
Yep, so we are accepting written comments. We've already received several letters from people that weren't able to make it tonight. And they are the different perspective than the majority of the people in this room, just to let you know. So that's what we are trying to balance. I just want you all to understand that. There are people that live in neighborhoods that will look out and see a field of solar panels across from them, and they don't necessarily agree with that. So I just want to put that out there, that there are members of the City of Concord. This is a great group, but you're all very like-minded, that we have to also balance sort of other parts of the city and those comments that we get back from them as well. At the end, I'll hold up a slide that'll have our contact information, and then you can send that to us.
Great. So I think I alluded to this earlier. There's like-mindedness and then there's science. How much of the presentation of this information to the community is going to be accompanied by the irrefutable facts and the consensus of the scientific community that we have to do something, regardless of what we want to look at, to stop climate change?
Our presentation was tonight, so that you were given that information. So the question was how much of the science of climate change and the imminent need for all of this renewable energy within the city will be presented along with these proposed changes. The 100% renewable policy is online. That information is available through the Energy and Environment Committee. The presentation tonight included a summary from the committee there.
So basically, what we've heard is what
Yep.
we're,
Yes.
thank you.
Yep, we'll put the presentation online as well, so other people that weren't there here tonight can also look at that.
The letters that you're getting have those who are not happy with some of the proposed changes. Is it just aesthetics of looking at it, or are there other things that we should address here?
They're concerned about the alteration of the land and if there's impacts to wildlife, currently how wildlife use the properties, like the larger scale properties. Health, there was a lot of mention of they were unaware of if there's any implications of living adjacent to a large scale solar installation. There's not research out there right now, and they're just concerned about their children growing up next to it. They don't want 10 years from now, say, I mean, it's possible if there's any electromagnetic radiation that's coming off of it. So their concern is that if your house is across the street from these sort of larger scale installations, what are the health impacts that'll be on them and their family, as well as the aesthetic impacts as well.
I was just thinking about all the flat roofed buildings downtown, which are, for the most part, are privately owned, so we can't tell them they have to have a solar panel. But I wondered if we could, the city could provide an incentive of some sort so that panels can be constructed downtown and benefit both that building and the downtown area.
So the question was whether the city can provide incentives for at least downtown businesses and other residences for putting solar panels up. So I believe we have the tax incentive. Okay, so we don't charge tax on the value of the solar panels for people that are using that solar power just for their building, for their own. It's a tax incentive. Currently is the incentive that the city has right now. Did you have something you wanted to add?
No, that's what I was going to say.
Okay.
I just wanted to add that I agree with other comments that have been made about how I think aesthetically this is not something that's going to have a deleterious effect on our community. But also, I'm truly excited about the idea of something that Concord has control over and that Concord benefits from directly, as opposed to other energy programs that have been recently proposed that would be kind of like big
heard going down through the state of New Hampshire, it would offer no benefit to local residents and certainly not create sustainable jobs for local residents. I'm really excited about doing something that is not going to be environmentally harmful and that will be economically powerful and that we have some control over, which is really unlike anything else that's been proposed by the utility companies, which I'm sure is why they certainly are not behind it. And I think it's really important for us to take control over our environmental and economic destiny, since our politicians at the state and national level don't recognize it as a concern.
Great. So it's tough summarizing these comments on the fly. Appreciative of the fact that this is something that the city can take control of our own destiny for renewable energy and economic benefits within the city and the environmental impacts, as opposed to something that's benefiting a larger utility or somebody outside of Concord. You had your hand up for a while.
What percentage of renewable power is in Concord right now?
Hmm.
The
question was what percent of renewable
You want
energy is in
100%,
Concord?
what percent do
Yeah,
you
where
have
are we?
right now?
That's a great question, actually. We don't have an exact answer for that right now, and I'd like to get to a better answer, but I think the best proxy I can give you is what Kathy was talking about earlier, which is the RPS requirement that applies to the utilities right now. Right now, under the State Renewable Portfolio Standard Program, utilities are required to buy RECs up to a certain percentage of their load, and it ticks up year by year. Right now, that number I think is about 17 or 18%, if I'm not mistaken, on its way to 25% by the year 2025. And then I think it stops at that point. So right now, we're at 17. If we sort of just did business as usual, relying on RECs, we'd get to 25, and that would be the end of it.
For these big solar farms, I'm just wondering if there's any data about how that impacts the property value of the residents nearby.
So the question was, how do the large solar farms impact the property value for nearby properties? Have you read any research or anything? No, and I spoke to our assessor, and they haven't. This is also new in New Hampshire, that I think it really hasn't been studied yet, but she was looking in Massachusetts and other locations, our city assessor, to try to get more information, because that has been a question that we've been looking at. And that was another comment, that letters that came in, they were afraid of what it would do to their property values if it went up.
Having just moved to Concord from a town that was about to be taken over by a gas pipeline, I think we should be setting a great example for those smaller towns that don't have the power, so to speak, that Concord has to do something like this. That's my comment, and then my question is for folks that already have solar panels or are thinking of putting them on, how would they then merge in with this project that we're talking about?
So, the 100% renewable
Yeah.
project? So they would be allowed to do the solar panel, as far as the ordinance discussion that we're having tonight, that's already allowed, that they could do that on their properties right now. So the question, I guess, would be, how do you account for that? Is there going to be some sort of self-reporting, or?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to come up with a system for that, and we'll have to figure that out. But basically, the way I think of it is this. The amount of, those people who are generating their own solar power from their rooftops are going to reduce the load for the rest of the city over from what it would otherwise have been. We're hoping for as much self-generated solar power as possible, but I think Rich may have alluded to this. Sort of studies say that maybe 20% of homes, something along those lines, are really suitable to solar panels on the roofs. So, you know, the question is, where are we going to get the rest of the 80%? And that's where we'll need to have, you know, be buying from projects like these or something located outside of town to hit that goal and get it delivered through the grid.
I think that
no evidence out there to reassure these people, and I think that's part of the marketing campaign. And also, if we have legislation that prohibits a profiteer from coming in and laying waste to some of our natural beauty in order to put up solar panels, particularly if the energy is going to be going somewhere else. We've seen that happen before. People in New Hampshire have stood up to that, and we're not going to turn this into that. I think it's that reassuring, coming up with evidence that's been used elsewhere, and I think, that will make people understand that this is popular.
So the comment was sort of do more research, provide information to those people that have concerns, look outside of New Hampshire, because this has been happening across the country for quite some time. Can I ask, all right, another poll question. Prime farmland, we do have active farmland within the city, and that's one of the natural resources that has been brought to attention. That another comment letter that we received from somebody was making sure that active farmland is protected. Does anybody have any thoughts, concerns, or want to see farmland protected over? I understand there's incentives for the farmers to make more money, but at the same time, we're giving up local food production, and that's another balance that we want to make as we're going forward with this ordinance change.
My family owns and runs a farm, and we don't see it as an either or. We see it as both and. We can certainly do livestock with solar, and we would love to do that.
Okay, so co-location would be something that you would support. Great.
Yeah, I would say similar. There's lots of great examples of doing both uses. One doesn't preclude the other. I know I was working for the city of Nashua, and one of our farms there put some big solar trackers, and they still were able to have crops and everything underneath them, so they could have both stacked, and there was no issue.
Okay, so New Hampshire has examples of co-locating projects.
And my daughter attended a school called the Putney School, and they have a huge solar array, and they have livestock and alpacas, and they're just grazing amongst it, and you can do both.
So support alpacas coming.
Alpacas plus solar.
And sheep.
One other thought about that is that you want food to be produced or whatever to be produced. And solar may enable a farm to actually stay in business since they're sort of on the edge. So that will mean whatever the whole farm is doing is going to stay.
Yeah, so it'll support the economics of the farm to continue to produce local foods.
And on top of that, it would also prevent those farms from going into housing developments and, apartment buildings, which have a lot of problems themselves, and which you can't grow any food on. So.
Right, yeah, and so that'll prevent farmers being forced into the decision to sell it for residential developments. Yeah. Any questions? All right, so since there's a lull in the conversation, this is our contact information. Heather and I were at City Hall, you can mail in letters. So this is the beginning of the public process. We're gonna all reconvene and sort of start working through the ordinance over the next couple months. The next public hearings will go to planning board, eventually to city council before any of these are adopted. There's a sign-in sheet at the back of the room if you want to put your email address and be updated on as we move forward with this project. Make sure you add that there and write legibly so we don't miss your email address. And just pay attention to the city's website for upcoming information. And this will be on Concord TV if anybody wants to let their friends know to watch it and provide us comments afterwards.
Just want to know, on those other comments that were sent to you, will they be available for us to see? The contents of what other people were.
We have them in our office. I don't know if we'll send them in May and make them available. The question is whether the other comment letters will be available to see. Do we have? Okay, so yes, that'll be online with our planning board report. So we have all that. So once that's going to planning board, all that information will be online. Right now, the physical copies are within our office if you want to come in and look at them. But then they'll be available online as we move forward through the public hearing process. Those will be shared with the Energy and Environment Committee and reviewed by city staff as we move forward. Great. All right, thank you everybody for coming. You can still make it home for the parents.